Here we are getting ready to start our boat ride. You can see the base of Marina Tower at the right-hand side as you look underneath the bridge. Again, be sure to look around because you're going to see a very rich area. If you look to the left, on the other side of the people on the boat, you can see the development that is already well established with bringing people from an elevated level of Michigan Avenue down Wacker Drive and into the river's banks. The boat shows this very clearly as you look around. You can see trees on the right-hand side being definitely trying to revitalize the vegetation. You can see entrance pathways of stairs connecting the elevations of the river and the street level. We're going to stop here at the first bridge. The bridges are great ways for us to kind of demark where we're located. The first bridge we're going to stop and have a brief talk on is the Clark Avenue Bridge. While we sit here just outside of the Clark Avenue Bridge, I want to talk a little bit about the Chicago River's rich history. It is not unique in its development or use, however. In fact, you can find similar patterns of use and development of communities around medieval European towns and developing countries that are fortunate enough to have a river. The Chicago River has been redesigned by humans, and again, it is not unique to urban rivers in the United States. However, many residents are not aware that the Chicago River flows backwards from its original mouth at Lake Michigan down to St. Louis. This reversal of the river going from the lake down to St. Louis is a reversal that we will discuss in much more detail. However, just know it was a major engineering feat and accomplishment at the time, before other rivers had such a design. The river is also a part of the system that includes the North Branch, South Branch, and main stem of the Chicago River. It encompasses 52 miles of constructed waterways that include the North Shore Channel, the Sanitary Ship Canal, and the Calumet Sag Harbor. The river system has played a central role in the history of Chicago, and it is a very keen example of the link between nature, natural resources, and urban development. When our city was incorporated in 1836, the river was an important transportation hub for the industrial development that linked the city both to the south down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, as well as through the Great Lakes to the east, where the concentration of population was actually based in the U.S. The first meatpacking plant was adjacent to the river and opened in 1829, and the first lumber mill in 1833. These two industries were located north of Wolf Point, which is where we're headed right now. And this is called the confluence of both the north and south branches of the river. The completion of the Illinois-Michigan Canal in 1848 linked Lake Michigan to the Mississippi. And this link to the Mississippi River dramatically increased the river's traffic. By 1860, the river had become the focus of the industrial development and had an emphasis on meatpacking and lumber for all of the Midwest. Now, as we travel underneath the bridge, look up and you can actually see cars going over the bridge. This is a fascinating architectural feat of combining and linking the south side of the city on the south side of the banks to the north side. If you look to the left, you can actually see newer development of bringing people down from the city streets on Michigan Avenue down to the lower levels of the river. And you can see many people enjoying this very sunny day in Chicago. To the right is just the opposition to what's going on the left. The right is a former factory that has now been regenerated into both restaurants, retail, and office space. These are such a major difference between the development of the river. As we head to the next bridge, you can see the vegetation and the revitalization of the river that is taking place. Not only are we bringing people down, but you can see businesses on the left opening up and people wanting to come to the river. This was not always the case because the river for a very long time was used as our quote-unquote toilet or wastewater deposit or receptacle. Let's stop at this bridge here and talk about what happened to the river and why it is just now regenerating. This is the Wells Avenue Bridge. Before we go underneath the Wells Avenue Bridge, I want to talk a little bit about sewage and wastewater and the history of the river. Early in the city's history, the river was used as a sewage outlet. Waste flowed into Lake Michigan, and unfortunately, as the river flowed into Lake Michigan, so did all the polluted sewage. This was the source of city's drinking water. We had several what they call cribs, which are water intakes, which you can still see today, 3 or 4 of them, just outside on Lake Michigan as you head towards Navy Pier. And they line all the way down to the south side of the city. These cribs or water intakes were how we got our water in Chicago. And it was contaminated with all kinds of pollutants from early meatpacking, including human sewage, which was deposited into the lake and flowed into the river. And so we drank the water out of these cribs in the lake and contaminated ourselves. This gave rise to very large waterborne diseases, and Chicago in the early years was definitely a pretty smelly and contaminated city because of its use of the river as kind of a waste receptacle. It wasn't until 1900 when the city decided to put together a sanitary ship canal, and that was built to protect the water supply and provide greater shipping capacity. The construction of this canal reversed the flow of the river. It cut through the Continental Divide. Unlike continental divides that you see out by the Rocky Mountains, where they're thousands of elevation in feet, here in the Midwest, they're just slightly elevated. And so it's easy to go through the Continental Divide in the Midwest. The Continental Divide is important because water on the west side of the Continental Divide, it actually flows down the Mississippi and naturally goes into the Gulf of Mexico. Water that is on the east side of the Continental Divide flows into Lake Michigan. And so we, in another very large engineering feat, controlled the flow of the river. We reversed it, and thereby having all of our pollution go down to St. Louis. And we did this by cutting through the Continental Divide. The river's reversal continues today. And unfortunately, St. Louis lost the Supreme Court case in 1900. What happened was the engineers in the city of Chicago, Alice Chesborough was the famous engineer who thought of this revolutionary way to reverse the river, started to have it dug, and by the time January 1st, in the middle of the night, the river reversal opened, the river had already changed its course. St. Louis brought the Supreme Court case to the courts, and unfortunately, they were not able to have it reversed. And so today, the river continues to flow backwards to St. Louis. Travel underneath the Wells Avenue Bridge. If you look around, again, you can see some very famous historical landmarks on the river. Look to the right as we come out from the bridge. This is one of our very famous buildings in history of Chicago. It is the Merchandise Mart. This building was originally owned by the Kennedys and has recently sold. However, it is so large that it has its own zip code and its own CTA stop. You can't see very well from here, but if you look at, there's heads of the famous entrepreneurs, the early entrepreneurs of Chicago, and their backs are to the river. The back of their heads are to the river, facing this very large merchandise mart. It really does represent how the river, until recently, was thought of as something that was for transportation and navigation and not something to be enjoyed. If you look to the left, just the opposite is happening. As you go around the flag, you could see many people enjoying the river and walking around the river. And this is the new areas that we have constructed on the north side of the bank of the river. We are heading to Wolf's Point. Wolf's Point is a very important spot, and we will pause there and it is the confluence where the North and the South rivers join the actual main canal here. Here we are as we are approaching Wolf's Point. I want to step back for a moment in time and talk a little bit about the early residents of the river. Sometime in the late 1770s, Jean-Baptiste Pont du Sable, a black man of French and African descent, was our first resident that we know of here on the river. His wife, a Potawatomi Native American woman named Kitawa, became the first known settlers to build a permanent home and actually raise a family on the banks of the Chicago River. They opened up what was a very successful trading post along the north bank of the river near the lakefront behind us. This is where the Michigan Avenue Bridge stands today. In time, a small community built up around them, and by the time DuSable sold his property in 1800, the DuSables had amassed a large estate, and Chicago was gaining a national recognition and attention as a strategic location for entrepreneurs and businessmen alike to come and grow an economy on the new frontier. So the first alterations to the river was going back as early as 1795. The Native American tribes at that time granted the United States rights to a 6-mile parcel of land at the mouth of the Chicago River. The Chicago River was not as open as it is today as you think about Navy Pier and the opening mouth of the river. In fact, there was a very large sand bank that had to be excavated by the U.S. government. And its first excavation failed because the sand would just fill in. Finally, the U.S. actually funded a deeper excavation, and we have the mouth of the river as we see it today here in Chicago. One of the first buildings built by the U.S. was Fort Dearborn, and 2 forts actually were built because the first one burned down. But the fort was erected right across from the river of the old DuSable estate to guard the Chicago portage area and formally claim the territory for the U.S. You can actually see a bronze plaque in the sidewalk at the intersection of Michigan and Upper Wacker Drive. This is the proximate site of Fort Dearborn. At the time, the Chicago River turned south to what is now Michigan Avenue, and it forced boats around this sandbar before it was dredged out. This made traveling very difficult to come in the river, so the dredging of the sandbar was necessary if commerce was going to grow. In 1833, Congress actually did the final completion to construct piers and fortify the channel so that this could become Chicago's largest asset, the river, for commerce and transportation.